Welcome to Shul.com. We are reading from the article of Joe Bobker, To Flee or to Stay. It's a in-depth article of an individual a Jewish man born in a displaced persons camp after the Holocaust. And he's discussing what happened prior to the Holocaust. Why did people not leave? Why didn't they see the warning signs? What really happened on the ground? So this is a multi-part series. We started yesterday, part 1. We're going into part 2 today. It's extremely interesting. He did a tremendous amount of research based on the facts. And these facts, they don't care about people's feelings. So, it's important to know what really happened on the ground prior to this Holocaust. Let's take a look. The enormity of the tragedy for Orthodox Jewry was crystallized in 1954 when Agudat Yisrael held its first post-Holocaust convention in Jewish Jerusalem. The Agudah paper Das Yiddish Wort, the Jewish word, described it as a bittersweet reunion. He has a note here on the bottom. When the Torah was translated from Hebrew to Greek in antiquity, the Septuagint, the word olah, like the korban, the burnt offering, became holokotoma, all right, which means entirely burnt in Greek. In the later Latin version, Vulgate, this word was translated as holocaustum. So olah, when everything was burnt, had the word holocaustum in Latin. In our home, he's talking about Joe Bobker, the Hitler years were referred to as the Churban, a day of absolute destruction, which is how the destruction of the temples was described. Churban Bayit Rishon, Churban Bayit Sheni. In Hebrew, the expression is Shoah, a devastation of biblical proportions, which appears over a dozen times in the Bible and is derived from Yeshaya 47-11. Shoah may also be related to Lashav, in vain. According to Rabbi Meir Levush, the Malbim, Shoah refers to a sudden darkness for which one cannot prepare. Interesting how the Malbim categorized that word, that, it was something that no one really knew. We never saw it coming, he writes over here. But the problem with this term...
When was the Malbim?
Malbim was in the 1800s. But the problem with this term is the germ. Let's see here where he continues. Is that it's always linked to the Bible, to the destruction of evil or evil people. Hardly an appropriate term to describe European Jewry. So what he's saying is that whenever you see the word Shoah in the Torah, it's not referring to the destruction on Jews, it's referring on the destruction of those that seemingly were not Jewish. This is an interesting point that he brings out. While the Churban, the word Churban would be more appropriate because the Churban and the word of Hazal would fit more in line. Very interesting. He did. Yeah, listen, when you do a research on etymologies, on words, you kind of learn new things, and you kind of also say, like, how did that word become the standard? He says in his house, he was a Holocaust survivor or born in displaced person camp, but his family survived, some of them, and they called it the Churban. They didn't call it the Shoah. Later on, it became called as the Shoah. Let's continue. The previous convention of the Agudat Yisrael had been held 17 years earlier in Austria, in 1937, at a time when a huge crowd of anxiety hung over all European Jewry. Rabbi Elchanan Wasserman, the Rosh Yeshiva of Baranowitz, addressed a few hundred distinguished rabbinic personalities and cautioned Torah Jewry against making any major decisions to stay or to flee at the Agudah without first seeking rabbinic advice, which is called Da'at Torah. We're going to talk about Da'at Torah in a different class of what that even means. What is Da'at Torah? It's one thing to translate it into English. What does it even mean? Does a person have to follow Da'at Torah? Is it halacha? Is it not halacha? Is it binding? What if Da'at Torah argues with what the current status of your rabbi says? It's a whole thing. We're going to go into that on a separate discussion. Rabbi B. Cohen from Muncie has a whole discussion of what Da'at Torah means, and we're going to go into it. But for this purpose, Rav Elchanan Wasserman, I didn't hear the actual speech, but what he's saying here is that he told people not to make any major decisions, to stay or to flee, without first seeking the Torah regarding how to respond to the looming threat. Let's take a look here. The concept of Da'at Torah is related to the ancient concept known as Emunat Chachamim, which generically meant that one should always trust in the judgment of the Talmidei Chachamim, the Torah wise or Gedolim, great ones, or Gedolei Torah or Gedolei Israel of the times. Their advice was sought. Ask your elders and they will tell you. She'al avicha v'yagedcha in Devarim 32-7, because after spending decades immersed solely in the Torah study, they had earned leadership positions that qualified them to render decisions that required a thought process elevated by divine guidance, which you would call Ruach HaKodesh. With his typical razor-sharp wit, Rabbi Yoel Teitelbaum of Satmar, aware of the fine line between Da'at Torah and potential deification, where, would quip, if you believe every Rebbe Maise, you're a shoite, and if you don't believe any, you're an apikoros. So that was Rav Yoel Teitelbaum saying, if you believe everything, every Rebbe is going to tell you every maaseh, you're a shoite and a shote. But if you don't believe anything, then that's already apikoros. Interesting. In 1924, Rabbi David Borenstein, the third Shakasha Rebbe, gave a fiery speech at the 4th National Convention of Agudat Yisrael in Poland, urging the audience to start making practical plans to move to the Holy Land. Very interesting. From there will come the everlasting life of Israel, reminding them that my grandfather, the Avnei Nezer, ruled that the commandment to settle the land of Israel still applies in this day and age. With a play on words, Rav Borenstein took the biblical term Agudato, his organization, and urged the Agudat Yisrael movement to build its base upon the Holy Land. Rav Borenstein dedicated every Shabbat, Shalosh She'udot Derasha, to urging his Hasidim to go to Palestine, especially Tel Aviv, because there was no church bells ringing there as in Poland. Many tried, but didn't have the funds. Those who succeeded survived the Holocaust. In the spring of 1940, Rav Borenstein and his family were offered an exit visa from Poland to Italy, then still a neutral country. He turned it down, explaining that his Hasidim, his students, and friends were also a family to him. In December 1943, Rav Borenstein became the last Jew to be buried in the Warsaw Cemetery. Wow. So he stayed back as a leader with his Hasidim, but he made clear at the Agudat convention prior to Rav Elchanan speaking, he made it clear. He's like, guys, there is a mitzvah. The Avnei Nezer, his grandfather, brought it down. You could leave, go set up, and everyone who followed him, his words, succeeded in surviving the war and rebuilding Israel. This is Rabbi David Borenstein, the third Shakasha Rebbe. The third Shakasha Rebbe. I'm not so familiar with all the movements of Hasidim, all the different cities, but I do happen to know this one because I know about the Avnei Nezer. Rav Wasserman, Rav Elchanan Wasserman, had a firm grasp of the severe threat looming over them. But even he, a Lithuanian Torah genius, brother-in-law of Rav Chaim Ozer Grzinski, and spiritual successor to the Chafetz Chaim, could not comprehend that Polish Jewry would cease to exist in just a few short years. You have to remember, these places were the Torah capitals of the world. It was not Israel at the time, it was Europe. In fact, many of the people that are in New York at the time, when they would go study, would not go study in Israel, the yeshiva. They would go study in Europe in the yeshiva. That's what they used to do. Nor that the staff, their families, and students of his beloved yeshiva would all be brutally slaughtered. Rav Wasserman never thought that would happen. Nor that he himself, together with a dozen other top Torah sages, would end up in a mass ditch outside of Kovno. Let's take a look what he says here. Rav Wasserman was captured in July 1941 while giving a shiur in the home of Rabbi Avraham Grzinski, Mashgiach of Slobodka, and murdered together with Rabbi Yosef Chaim Zaks, the Rosh Yeshiva of Ohel Moshe, Slobodka. His son, Rabbi Moshe Rice, Rabbi Ze'ev Velvel, Grzinski, son of the Mashiach of Slobodka, his brother-in-law, Rabbi Shabsai Vernikovsky, from the Lomza Yeshiva, Rabbi Shabsai's son, Mordechai, Rabbi Yonah Karpilo, student of the Briskerov, Rabbi Yeheskel Bernstein, Rosh Yeshiva of Or Yisrael of Slobodka, Rabbi Elazar Menachem Shachs Rebbe in Vaboilnik, Rabbi David Gader, Rabbi Tzavi Schneider, Rabbi Yaakov Shlomo Gurevitz, and Rabbi Isser Shor. 2 rabbis managed to escape. Rabbi Yisrael Yaakov Lubchansky, Mashgiach of the Baranovitsk Yeshiva, and Rabbi Ephraim Oshri, author of the 5-volume classic She'elot Utshuvot Mima'amakim, the most comprehensive collection of Holocaust responsa to come out of World War II. The killers didn't take Rav Grzinski because he was lying down to rest his ailing foot. They only wanted rabbis who could walk so they could be paraded through the streets at gunpoint. The circumstances of Rav Wasserman's murder are recorded in Rav Oshri's Chorban Lita, The Annihilation of Lithuanian Jewry, 1995. See also Rabbi Simcha Wasserman's introduction in Kovitz He'arot. Interesting.
So they shot the guy that couldn't walk. Is that what he just said?
He said they didn't take him with him. He didn't mention if they shot him there, but it says they didn't take him with him because they wanted to parade the people in the streets to show, their pride on them. In fact, not a single Aguda attendee could foresee that their families and communities would be reduced in the near future to freakish exhibits of mountain of hair, gold teeth, eyeglasses, and shoes. Nobody thought this. At the Jerusalem Convention, Rabbi Eliezer Silver, a driving force behind the Vaad Hatzalah in the United States, addressed the broken-hearted remnants of the Knesiyah Gedolah and described the rabbis of the previous convention as numerous arcs of living Torah scrolls, Geunim, and saints whom we no longer have with us. However, we are blessed because we now have the sanctity of the Holy Land and Jerusalem. All present understood the historic reality that the 600,000 Jews of the Holy Land were spared the Nazi maelstrom, while every single Jewish community in Central and Eastern Europe was destroyed. It's unbelievable. In less than 6 years, Orthodox European Jewry ceased to exist. There was no significant trace of Torah or Jewish life anywhere on the entire continent, but not a single civilian Jew in the Holy Land, nor in the United States of America, was harmed by Adolf Hitler's Third Reich. So 2 countries in particular were saved, and that was America and Israel. There were others too that also. There were a few others also.
Not one Jew was killed by the Nazis
in Morocco. Okay, let's take a. Yemenite had their own issues in Yemen with the terrorists over there. Let's see, and more. The tiny, poverty-stricken Yishuv in Israel, with no natural resources and itself under serious existential threat, took in more Jews than the rest of the Jewish world combined, including the large and unthreatened Jewish community of America. What he says here, he brings down this from Abraham J. Idleheit in the Yishuv in the Shadow of the Holocaust, and you can take a look at that source. When details of the devastating extent of what Hitler had wrought began to trickle out, many Orthodox survivors realized that they and their leaders had sincerely and humanely erred. The Jewish quarter of Warsaw lay in ashes. The streets of Tel Aviv were bustling. The streets of Siget were bare. Not so the crowded alleys of Jerusalem. In less than a decade after the Holocaust, dozens of Polish, Lithuanian, and Russian Hasidic Rebbes, Rabbanim, and Charedim, including, just to name a few, the courts of Boyan, Bohish, Hosiatin, Karlin, Kursin, whose Rebbe, Rabbi Yaakov Yisrael Rabinovitz, was the first Rebbe to settle in Tel Aviv, Kotsk, Lelov, Lublin, Modzich, Nadvorna, Ozharov, Radzin, Ruzin, Sadigura, Slonim, Sochaku, Strikov, Chortkov, Vizhnitz, and more found safety and shelter in Tel Aviv. That was in less than a decade after the Holocaust. He brings down, with more than 700 Hasidic shuls and shtibelach, Tel Aviv served as the nerve center of the Hasidic world for nearly half a century, from the rise of Adolf Hitler in the early 1930s to the 1970s. It was comparable in size and quality to any pre-Holocaust European Hasidic stronghold, as brought down in Tzvi M. Rabinovich, and the editor of the Encyclopedia of Hasidim, 1996. That's actually probably a good book to reach out to understand all the different sects of the Hasidut. In Jerusalem, one could bump into such surviving Admorim of Europe as Ger, Sochako, Spinka, Amshinov, Biala, Pruzsusha, Slonim, Rachmashrivka, and others. Those that went out early and settled in Israel, they survived, and they were building their communities. It is a great salvation from the Almighty, sighed Rabbi Aharon Rokeach, the Belzer Rebbe, after being on the run for 4 years, that the Jewish people have a place to go. He has a note here on the bottom. Well, let's read one more line, and then we'll read the note. Those who reached the promised land ensured the survival of themselves, their families, and something too often forgotten, untold future generations. You see, a lot of times people are they're thinking of themselves, but they're forgetting that the survival of the Jewish people is also at hand when a family survives.
So how do you, if you see today, God forbid, these guys standing with the other side, and the most fanatic, whatever, and then you have this, and they're the same people now.
John, there's a reason why we're coming here to learn. And there's a reason why I'm talking about this very controversial subject, and we're going to be doing a panel very soon with some major speakers discussing this in detail from the halakha point of view and Torah point of view. But we want to know, we're, Baruch Hashem, fortunate to be close enough to the Holocaust period to actually have this knowledge. We're very far from the Chorban Bayit Rishon. We're a little bit farther from some of the other atrocities that happened a few hundred years ago. But this was only about 70, 80 years ago. So we have a lot of information that we can kind of see, okay, what happened there and what's happening here, and are these similar or not? And one thing for sure that we're seeing is that many people in the past, they called it wrong. And those that called it right and the people that followed them seemingly did survive. And by the way, the difference between back then and now is that back then it was Palestine. It wasn't ruled by Palestinian, because Palestine was never ruled by Palestinian people in the history of the world and never will. But it was ruled by the British, or like say the Ottoman before. And it's important. But today, at least you have a Jewish government, whether it's secular, religious. That's not for the detail today, but at least you have that option, and you have what's called the law of return. Let's continue. Before the war started, the Belzer Rebbe had told a Polish family in the process of fleeing to Palestine that they need not leave Europe. Many years later, the Rebbe, now safe in Palestine, met the head of the same family who had settled in Sfat and admitted he had made a mistake which pained him by not encouraging all his Hasidim to leave Europe earlier. He later confided in others that he wished he had followed the example of the Vilna Gaon and the Chafetz Chaim, who encouraged groups of Jews to leave Europe and move to Palestine 100 years earlier, thus saving their descendants and descendants' descendants. Let's take a look at note number 9 over here.
Well, there could be a difference between moving to Israel at that time and creating a government.
The government doesn't go into yet. We're going to go into that. I think he's.
No, but I think these guys today said Israel, the government is no good, so.
Again, that's not relevant to this discussion. The discussion here is talking about whether there will be a catastrophe and whether there's a place to run to. You're right, we can go into the whole government thing, but that's not for today. There were 180,000 Jews in Palestine on the day Hitler became chancellor. By the time the war was over, the number was 600,000. So what that means is before 1948, there was about 180, and by the time the war was over, 45, it was 600. That means almost 420,000 people moved. By the end of the century, Israel's population included over 5 million Jews. Unbelievable.
So fast.
And it's growing even bigger. Let's finish this page. Halachic ambiguity. Now, it's interesting about the Belzer Rebbe. You have to, when a person makes a statement that seemingly can cause an effect that other people listened and quoted, and seemingly he realized that maybe he wants to take a step back. And he met the person that he told to stay in Europe, and the person said, I'm not listening to you. I'm going to Israel because I want to save my family. You know, it takes a big man, a big gadol. That's what makes him a gadol, to say, okay, you know, there was a mistake there. That's what makes a gadol. A gadol is not somebody.
What do you say? You say make a mistake?
He told one of the guys not to go. He said, stay in Europe. This guy said, I'm not staying in Europe. He violated what the rabbi told him. I don't know if he violated, but he didn't listen to what the rabbi told him. He said, I'm going to Israel. I'm going to save my family and my future generations. And he moved to Sfat. Later on, the Belzer Rebbe saw him. And he realized that was the same person he told him to stay in Europe. And everyone else he told him to stay in Europe didn't survive. And he took a step back. He said, I made a mistake, and it wasn't the appropriate thing to say. Rabbi Avraham Yeshaya Karlitz, who was the Chazon Ish, Karlitz, survived the Holocaust by not being there. What does that mean, not being there? Let's take a look at the note on the bottom. When he was living in Vilna, Rav Karlitz was approached by a Jew who was considering immigrating to Palestine. Rav Karlitz advised him to stay in Europe because that was where the Chafetz Chaim lived, and where the Rav Minyan, the higher portions of Klal Yisrael, the yeshivot were, and thus dino ke'eretz Yisrael, as if it were in Eretz Yisrael. So, when a Jew asked the Chazon Ish whether to move, he told him stay in Europe. He says that's where the Chafetz Chaim is, that's where all the yeshivot are. He says dino ke'eretz Yisrael. We've heard this statement, dino ke'eretz Yisrael. People saying Berlin is the new Jerusalem and Paris is the new Zion. We've heard and read this in the past. But the Chazon Ish was not in there. In 1933, the year that Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany, Rav Karlitz, the Chazon Ish, arrived in Bnei Brak. So that was like about 5 years before it really changed in Palestine, after Rabbi Chaim Ozer Grzinski had encouraged him to get more involved in communal affairs. His aliyah also saved several of the Chazon Ish relatives who left Europe because of him, including his older brother, Rabbi Meir Karlitz, two nephews, Rabbi Shlomo Shimshon Karlitz of Vilna, Lithuania, and Rabbi Eliezer Alpa from Ulshan, Russia, and Rav Shlomo Shimshon's parents. Unbelievable. Tomorrow we will continue in discussing to flee or to stay. Baruch Adonai le'olam. Amen ve'amen.